So for this next session, we're gonna go and dive into AppZen Coach, which is a fairly new dashboard that most people probably haven't seen. So I'm gonna treat this kind of as an educational course of what exactly it does and how this affects your policy as it looks for ways to find where you're slowing down and inefficient based on your data and based on the pattern analysis that we have. Now, when we look at AppZen Coach, we take a look right now today at all of your patterns and trends. So we look and we notice that there's a large area and categories that you flag, that you review, but then we notice that there's a trend of an approval rate of, let's say, 99% of the time, you stop this type of expense, but you let it go. Now, the reasoning behind this is probably two things. There is an exception involved when you stop and you review something, kind of like the case they were talking about earlier with the business class. It always comes in, but then somehow, 99% of the time, it always gets approved. So why are we wasting our time 100 times a week, 1,000 times in a month looking at this? There's clearly an exception, there's a gray area that allows this to go through. But what is that exception, and why does it need me to review this constantly? And that's what we're reviewing. Because we see that in most cases, your policy said you have to stop it. But your policy probably hasn't been updated in the last 30 years also. So it's merging that gap of what you say versus what you do. Your policy is what you're supposed to do, but in reality, the approvals is something different, of course, okay? And you can see here on the example here, it's a little bit small. Part of that AI agent is when you're live in the application, what's gonna be coming up soon is, we're gonna take a look at the dashboard, but having a live pop-up. So you're not looking at a dashboard for analytics, it's actually in the workbench as you're looking at an expense report. So kind of like a virtual assistant constantly that tells you, by the way, 99% of the time, you approve this exact scenario that we see, okay? So I'm gonna kind of give a description of where to find AppZen Coach because most of everybody here probably hasn't seen it. So if you're logged in, you have your laptop, you can actually do this as we go over. And then I wanted to hear from the audience who has used AppZen Coach and kind of what they do with it and what kind of results they get. Now, when we look at analytics, I typically see two types of personas. Persona A is the person that says, I don't have enough information, I get very little reports, I don't know what to focus on, how do I get better? And then there's Persona B, which is the exact inverse. They're gonna say everything the opposite of Persona A. They're gonna say there's too much reporting, there's too many spreadsheets, there's just too much data, what do I focus on, and how do I get better? And we see that there's another trend where they're actually saying the same questions and they have the same problem. And how do we meet them in the middle? And this is where AI analytics comes into place. So it's not just staring at a pie chart that you could take a look and have an analysis. I'll look at that same pie chart and have a completely different analysis. So it goes into a deeper level of what that is on the AI side. So AI Coach goes over the patterns just like a data scientist would. So instead of living in those spreadsheets, I am not an Excel nerd, nor do I want to be one, but this does all of that work for you. So dependent on when you went live, so I have some customers that are going live, maybe went live, it takes about 2 or 3 months of data to pick up on all of these patterns. It wants to see what have you done, let's say over 1,000 times to give you a correct pattern. We don't want to look at something that's 4 or 5 times because that's not really a trend that we see. So here's an example. You can see here, this is a list of all of the models that we have, and you can see these are the many times that we've seen the results. So going on that first line, unauthorized expenses, 7.6 thousand times. Now, as an auditor, when you see that flag, it's your job to put that review into a bucket. It's a false positive, it's a true positive, it's an exception. There's a result that you have to do, okay? And so we analyze that and we say, well, out of 7,000 times, only 718 were rejected. So that tells me 90% of the time, it's actually approved. Why was it approved 90% of the time? And that's what we dive into. How can we get this away from your view for those other 90% times? So for AppZen Coach, it's taking a look at those trends, and of course, kind of a future state is what Luke talked about of how we can kind of ask questions, and it gives you the output. So we're gonna look at like what categories do I approve the most, and you can use this for either approvals, which I recommend, or rejections. The caveat to that is if you use this kind of workflow for rejections, you're just getting more work on your desk. I would recommend to use it for the reverse. Get the work out. If you're always approving it 95% of the time, well then just let it go through. We wanna kind of get it away from our desk. So here's some real life examples that we saw. If anyone wants to log in and take a look at your data, you would start at the dots at the very top, and you can see there it's listed as AppZen Coach dashboard. Now, when you go into the dashboard, this is actually someone's data here. So you can see the rule name is unauthorized expenses, and it's for taxi. And that first line is saying taxis and vehicle rentals, and it gives you some insight. It says 97.6 times it's been approved. There's 20,000 lines, and it was approved at an action rate of 98% of the time. So that means 20,000 times you stopped it, and only 2% of the time did it actually give you a result. Then it goes deeper. Then it says, well, then there was Uber from $20 to $50, and that had a 99% approval rate. Then it gives you $50 to $100, and then $100 to $200. So it's just taking that category and going into a deeper level, which is essentially telling us for taxis from $0 to $200, there's really no point of flagging this. If we add up all of these lines, that's about 40,000 lines, and now we have the proof from your own data. And again, I'm not an Excel nerd. It just tells me exactly why are we looking at this 99% of the time. It's just wasting the auditor time. We already know the end result. And so this is just one category. And so there's a long list depending on how much transactions you have, and you can take a look at your expenses. Now, if you look at this bottom one, I blocked out the name. You can see it on that far right. I won't tell you who, but it's someone's data in this room. So if you think you don't have patterns, you do. You're sitting in this room now. So you can see that there's one for airfare, and it tells you from $100 to $1,000, 91 times it saw this, 100% approval, which means, why is this in your policy? It has never been rejected, and you're not gonna see one. And so if I were to do an analysis and say, let's follow this for another 6 months, and to a year, I would bet $10 we're still gonna see that 100%. It's not gonna inverse itself and show 0%. So these are the small tricks that tells you, hey, we've looked at your data, and so if everyone, and most people ask, how do we get more efficient? How do I get faster? Where am I wasting my time? This dashboard tells you exactly with your data how to do that. Now, in general, for generative AI, we're taking all of that data that we get in, we go through analytics. The real net result is we want you guys to make better decisions. So the trend that I see, and you can kind of judge for yourself, how accurate is your policy from reality versus the policy? What you say versus what you do, and that's kind of what we're diving into. So we waste a lot of time because the policy says we have to do this, but then there's always that gray area of the exception. It goes through because and X, Y, and Z. Now, of course, the pain points of this is essentially, it just wastes a lot of time. If anyone has a data scientist that can do this type of work, it would take a lot of time to discover all of this. And so this dashboard, there's no charge to it, it's free. I recommend everyone to, at the minimum, kind of take a look at this. This is fairly new, so I don't know how many people have kind of seen this or used this. So we can kind of take our first pause. Are there any customers that have used Coach and have kind of like seen their data? 1, 2. So Teresa, I know you've seen it. If you could, is there a mic for her, by the way? Teresa, could you give an introduction and kind of tell us, when did you first hear about AppZen Coach for your patterns?
So my name is Teresa Thomas. I work at Wells Fargo. And I first heard about it from my manager who went to, was part of one of the CAPs or something like that, and came back.
AppZen on tour.
Yeah, and she was just all, so we met with Saman and took a look at our data, and I think you actually showed our, the airline, because that's one that we have changed recently because of Coach. We had no idea we were approving all of these airlines, those expenses that were coming in, until we took a look at Coach. 100% of the time, we were approving the things that were flagged. So my auditors were looking at lines and lines of data because we had it set at $74.99. Your policy's the 75. So we had it set at $74.99, and they were looking at every single line. And as soon as we switched that, and we're still looking to switch, I have to build cases and take it to, to get that number moved. But right now we're at 650, which has decreased our number of lines for airline substantially. So I'm trying to get it up to the 1,500 to 2,000 mark, which the data clearly shows within Coach. Now I'm very excited about being able to drill down in and get that, but the patterns that you can find in Coach are just amazing.
No, what's interesting is Teresa's one of my customers. On her pattern analysis, that image wasn't your data, but if you remember, your data was on airfare, and then it broke it down from United and Delta and Southwest. So kind of like how we saw that taxi to Uber, and then if you said, well, what about Lyft? It can go by the merchants, and it just goes into a deeper layer one by one. Now, in totality, I know you haven't made all of the corrections yet, but could you give an idea of like what do you expect or what kind of results from this change do you see for Wells Fargo? Because you guys have a lot of volume and transactions per month.
Yeah, because we are, our corporate credit card program is corporate bill, corporate pay. So we only allow one expense report a month. So the expenses that come through, if we've got a lot of travel, especially, being a bank, we've got a lot of sales and stuff going on, and our financial advisors, we could be anywhere in one report. There could be 50 to, seen 120, I think, lines in one specific report. So you take an auditor that most of those are going to flag as high, and we take a look at it, and it's going to take them probably an hour to do that one report. So we do about 3 million, in between 2 to 3 million lines a year, and we're at 25 to 30,000 reports a month. So, we need to decrease the volume as much as we can. So was that the question?
Yeah, and Teresa, you guys have, or you're creating kind of a process, I think, that you kind of wanted to show to your upper management. Could you kind of share exactly like, how do you build, I guess, that use case? When you look at this dashboard, what's that next step? What do you do from that dashboard, and how do you present that?
So that's a good question. I'm still working on it. But I'm taking the Coach analytics, and I'm saying, okay, we've proven with the data that out of all of these lines, we have approved this 100% of the time. And the amounts that are put in there, you saw on the one slide that it had the 100 to, or the 600 to 1,000 or whatever. And so I'm taking that data, and we have 6 different policies based off of the countries that we're in and the types of business that we have. And so I have to present it based off of each of those policies because they have different owners to each one. So I have to break it out that way. And so AppZen is allowing me through the reporting to do that.
Now, I think there was one hand over here. And did you say you have used Coached already? You've kind of seen some pattern analysis? If we can pass the mic to her, Can you tell us, what did you see, I guess, in your experience from Coach?
Similar to the same before, where there are certain, I mean, when you're auditing, you have a feeling that you're seeing the same thing over and over and you're always approving it. It's good to see it. But another part of it for us is we do have international business where, from a tax purpose, we require itemized receipts no matter what the amount is. And we, from an expense approval team, have gone to tax and said, I mean, this is stupid. Like, I'm not going to make somebody give me a coffee receipt for $2 or €2. They want it, but then we go to HR and say, but would we ever decline that and make the associate pay if they didn't have an itemized receipt? And they say, no, we'll still pay it. So we still have this because tax still wants us to require these receipts, but we're approving 83% of them. So now we can go back and say, can we at least raise that limit to test it like €20, €25, and get that down a little bit so we're not sending back a receipt to somebody, most of the time an hourly associate, who will then take 2 months to reply and resubmit and not get their money for that? Or can we, just maybe raise that risk a little bit on our end, but make it easier for the associate and do that balance between associate happiness and tax risk?
Do you have an estimate of like what is a good percentage? Like, I know for Wells Fargo, when they say something that's 100%, well, clearly, right? That's acceptable. Even 99, 98%. Is there a threshold that you may think is, that line where we say, you know what, this is enough? Is it 80? Is it 90%?
It's actually one thing, and you can, and I haven't dug deep enough into it. I would like to see the breakdown by organization because we have multiple policies and I would like to pull out U.S. versus everyone else, because for U.S. it would be, very low. Like, I would expect to not approve anything maybe 20% of the time, maybe less. International, I would expect it right now as it is to be higher in like the 80%, but then as we change it, I would want to see that drop down to match kind of the U.S. amount. So I would be comfortable with like a 20 to 30% approval rate versus an 80 to 90%. So, but we had the same thing with, the one thing I will say is we have it on verification amount because just as a whole, we want to look at anything over $7,500. But if you're buying a business class airfare ticket, it's going to be more than that. And then that goes back to the rule of I can't put an exception into amount verification, but I can put it in expense type. So just learning how to kind of manipulate our rules so we can clear those 100% auto approvals and not waste our time anymore.
This is also kind of a good precursor of how, when they talked about the DIY apps that you can kind of create, of like, what are those exception areas? This kind of gives you the history of where your exceptions are. So it's kind of telling you exactly this category, that model, this is what we see of the most. So when you go into the DIY framework, and if you wanted to create that exception, you could essentially just copy what is in AppZen Coach. I kind of see that as a future case of what is in Coach. You can just hopefully right away accept the pattern when it says, pattern ID X, this is what you're doing at this rate. Would you like to make this an exception? You could just hit yes, and that exception just goes into your workflow then. So it kind of gives you a good heads up of, what to look for, what to see kind of in the future. So for people, depending on kind of like your journey, so I know with Amol over there, like when we ask questions like, how do we get better? What can we look at? This is a good example of, I think in 90 days, we would have enough data and we can take a look at patterns. And so hopefully everybody is kind of going through this with their CSMs to seeing like, what is the underlying data and the patterns that you guys see within your business. So you have the right information to make a recommendation. You go to your boss and say, I think we're wasting our time here. Here's the data to prove it. And here's exactly like where we can make changes, if changes are accepted, of course. Any questions? We can kind of leave it open forum also if there's any questions from anybody in the audience. Yes, Amol.
Does this coach also have a feedback loop into the standard apps itself or the standard audit models?
So As far as giving a reaction, so there's a trigger and an action that happens, it's part of the custom exceptions. So when it looks at a particular transaction, like we use that example of the taxi, that's a standard model. Now, what you want as a net result is the end action. We stopped it, now it's on your desk. We want to automate that ending part as well. So the event would be, in this scenario, for this event, of this category, for this model, it doesn't need to come to your desk. You can already say that we've seen this 99% of the time, so let's not bother you with it. Let's just let it streamline and go through. So a lot of this framework, I would use it to increase efficiencies versus to stop and flag. You can do both. You can create exceptions to stop some things, but those are a lot more rare of an occurrence. When we see patterns that say 10,000 and 20,000 lines, it's best to use it to streamline your process. These are the small ways when we always show what your auto approval is, your efficiency, and we want to get everyone in that, let's say, 60 to 75% auto approval rate. These are the small changes that can get you up every quarter higher and higher. So depending on what you're looking for, whether it's cost reduction or an efficiency boost, this is the best way to do that.